Ladies and gentlemen, let's confront the truth. Relationships, particularly the bond between men and women, are not as simple as we would like them to be. They are complex, and they demand something of use and understanding, an awareness, a willingness to grow. Now, here is the thing. Men and women are different. And in the midst of this difference, mistakes are mistakes that can drive us apart rather than bring us together. Today, we focus on 5 critical mistakes that women often make with men. Mistakes that undermine relationships, undermine trust, and undermine the very foundations of what it means to connect with another human being. But this isn't about blame. This is about growth as individuals and growth as partners. Understanding these mistakes isn't about casting judgment. It's about creating the potential for something more meaningful, something stronger. And if we can recognize these pitfalls, we can begin to address them not just with men, but with ourselves. It's time to get real, to challenge assumptions, and to ultimately build relationships based on mutual respect, mutual growth, and mutual understanding. Key here is something that many women, and frankly many people in relationships, fail to fully grasp. Communication is not just about talking, it's about clarity. And when it comes to women and men, it often seems like T here is a fundamental breakdown in how they communicate with each other. You see, the issue isn't just that communication happens at different levels of complexity for each genderno, it's far deeper than that. It's the way in which one person, often unknowingly, expects the other to read between the lines, to decipher feelings, to intuitively know what's going on without saying it outright. This is a mistake that can derail relationships faster than anything else, because when people fail to communicate clearly, they set themselves up for disappointment and frustration. In a world that demands emotional vulnerability, men can struggle with reading cues. Women, on the other hand, are often more adept at processing emotions, at making subtle connections between actions and feelings, but they sometimes forget that men, while equally emotional, may not always show it in the same way or in the same order. The problem here is that women, in their desire to communicate, often make the mistake of assuming that a man can know what she's feeling or thinking simply because she's thinking it or feeling it. But communication does not work like that. Men, much like anyone, need explicit clarity. Without it, a man might be left wandering in a fog of uncertainty, unsure of how to respond, unsure of how to act. This lack of clarity can lead to misunderstandings, which over time can create distance, confusion, and resentment. When you are in a relationship, if your needs are not expressed clearly, T here is a good chance they won't be met. Think about it. If you want someone to do something for you, if you want them to understand something that's important to you, if you want them to act in a way that makes you feel seen, heard, and cared for, you must speak up. It's not enough to hint. It's not enough to expect someone to simply understand. It's essential to articulate what you need and how you feel with directness and honesty. Otherwise, the person you are with might end up trying to meet needs that are completely different from the ones you actually have, and that's when frustration starts to take root. But this issue is far from one-sided. Let's be clear here. Men, too, need to learn how to listen, how to be attuned to the subtleties of communication, how to listen with empathy, and not just with their ears, but with their hearts. But the responsibility still lies, to a large degree, with the one communicating. And the truth is, women are often hesitant to be direct. Key here is this reluctance to demand something from a partner, or this belief that being too direct will somehow ruin the magic of the relationship, or that it will make them come off as needy, or even worse, unlovable. But here is the thing. Expressing needs clearly is not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of desperation. It's a sign of strength, maturity, and emotional intelligence. When you can clearly say what you need and do so in a way that invites the other person to understand you, you take control of your own happiness. You take responsibility for your emotional well-being, and you give the other person the chance to show up for you in a way that makes sense. This is not manipulation. It's not playing games. It's honest communication. And yet, so often this doesn't happen. Instead, we see the opposite, a subtle dance of miscommunication. A woman might say, "I am fine," when she's not fine at all. Or she might express anger or frustration in a way that leaves the man confused and questioning what he did wrong. Key here is a tendency to hold things in, to withdraw, to expect the other person to understand, without explicitly stating why something is bothering you. And the man, confused by the change in mood, unsure of the cause, may make the mistake of thinking he did something wrong, or worse, begin to doubt his ability to read his partner's needs at all. It's a downward spiral from there, one that leads to resentment, frustration, and the eventual breakdown of trust. The beauty of clear communication, on the other hand, is that it allows both people to show up as their authentic selves, without pretense, without hidden expectations. When you communicate with clarity, when you can tell someone what you need, or what you are feeling, or what is bothering you, you give the other person the tools to respond in a way that makes sense. It invites dialogue rather than distance. It nurtures growth rather than stifling it. And here is the key part: when both parties can communicate in this direct, clear manner, the relationship becomes a place of understanding rather than conflict. So, what's the takeaway here? Don't expect your partner to read your mind. Don't wait until you are overwhelmed with emotion to finally speak up. Don't let resentment build because you haven't clearly communicated what's going on inside. Be direct, be clear, and understand that this doesn't make you less desirable. It makes you more real, more capable of fostering true intimacy. Relationships thrive when clarity takes center stage. Without it, they are bound to falter. The mistakes we make in relationships and in life are often rooted in our inability to communicate what we truly need, what we really feel. If you can overcome that mistake, if you can step into the courage it takes to speak with clarity, you are on the path to creating a relationship that's not only fulfilling, but one that stands the test of time. It's that simple. And yet, it's that profound. One of the most profound, and I would argue dangerous, mistakes women make with men is the failure to establish and respect boundaries. We are creatures, after all, bound by our limits. And without those limits, without those lines that we draw in the sand, relationships can become disoriented, misaligned, and ultimately destructive. Now, many women might think, well, of course I respect boundaries. And yet, the reality is that in many relationships, boundaries aren't respected, or worse, they are misunderstood. What happens then? Chaos. A lack of respect for personal boundaries breeds resentment, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of being trapped. When boundaries are not set clearly, or worse, when they are violated consistently, it undermines trust and, with it, the very foundation of the relationship. What do I mean by boundaries? Well, they can be many things. Boundaries can be emotional, physical, psychological, or even spiritual. They are the lines we draw in order to protect our peace, our identity, and our well-being. But here is the thing that often gets overlooked. Boundaries are not just something you need to establish with others, they're something you need to establish with yourself first. If you cannot define what your boundaries are, if you cannot communicate them clearly, then how can you expect anyone else to respect them? This is where the problem lies. Women often feel a deep need to please, to nurture, to give, to love, and that is admirable to a degree. But in doing so, they may unknowingly sacrifice their own boundaries, their own emotional health, and even their own sense of self. Here is the reality: men are different from women. They do not always interpret the signals the way women intend. A man might not see a woman's subtle hint about a boundary, or worse, he might dismiss it altogether, thinking it's a request rather than a need. It's vital to recognize that In order to maintain a healthy relationship, it's not enough to assume someone understands where your boundaries lie. If you don't communicate them firmly, clearly, and unambiguously, you risk creating an environment in which you are constantly compromised, constantly giving more than you can afford to give, or constantly feeling taken advantage of. And make no mistake, that kind of environment is toxic, and it's only a matter of time before both people become bitter, resentful, and disconnected. The issue here is not about controlling the other person, nor is it about being rigid. Boundaries are not about restricting freedom, but rather preserving it. They are a means by which two people can coexist in a space where mutual respect and understanding are the norm. It's about knowing who you are, knowing what you need, and being willing to defend that space for the sake of your own well-being. And it's not just about creating these boundaries for yourself, it's about communicating them effectively. To some women, the idea of setting boundaries might seem uncomfortable or even unnatural. They fear that if they make their needs and limits clear, they might be perceived as demanding or difficult. But I tell you, the opposite is true. When you fail to set boundaries, you are not being generous or kind, you are being self-destructive. You are allowing yourself to be steamrolled by the demands of others. And in doing so, you sacrifice your own happiness, your own peace, and your own dignity. Respecting boundaries, of course, is not just about setting them. It's also about recognizing and respecting the boundaries of others. Relationships, at their core, are about two individuals coming together with respect for one another's autonomy, individuality, and personal space. And when you enter a relationship, you must remember that you are still two distinct people with separate needs, separate desires, and separate lives. You do not own each other, nor should you. Each person has their own inner world, their own boundaries, and these need to be honored if the relationship is to remain healthy. It's when these boundaries are violated, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that we begin to see the unraveling of connection, of intimacy, of trust. Think about the power dynamic that gets created when boundaries are not respected. The person who is constantly giving, constantly compromising, and constantly bending is the one who becomes exhausted, worn thin. They begin to resent their partner, and their emotional reserves dwindle until here is nothing left to give. Meanwhile, the person who has no boundaries, or who violates the boundaries of the other, is left unaware of the toll they're taking. They fail to see the erosion happening beneath the surface. This leads to one of two outcomes. Either the person with no boundaries becomes disillusioned, bitter, and closed off, or the one who has been constantly giving up their boundaries withdraws completely, emotionally and physically, from the relationship. Either way, the relationship ends up weak, fractured, and ultimately unfulfilling. It's essential to recognize the need for boundaries not only in romantic relationships, but in every relationship. A lack of boundaries in a relationship with a partner might be just the beginning. If you cannot enforce and respect your own personal space, then it becomes much harder to do so with anyone else, be it friends, family, or co-workers. Boundaries are the key to self-respect, and without self-respect, a relationship cannot thrive. But here is the silver lining. You can change this. You can set boundaries, and you can demand that they be respected. You can stop giving away pieces of yourself to the point where you don't recognize who you are anymore. Setting clear, healthy boundaries requires courage, yes, but it also requires a deep sense of self-worth. It requires you to believe that you are deserving of respect, that you are deserving of space to grow, to feel, and to breathe without the constant fear of being overwhelmed or smothered. When you embrace your own boundaries, you empower not only yourself, but also the relationship you are in. You create an environment where both people can flourish, where respect isn't just a passive state, but an active, mutual practice. So, don't make the mistake of neglecting your boundaries. Don't allow yourself to get lost in the desires of others. Your boundaries are your gift to yourself and to the relationship. Respect them, uphold them, and make sure that the person you are with is doing the same. Only then can you truly build something worth having, something that will endure. There is a profound misunderstanding in relationships today, one that stems from a lack of awareness about the fundamental differences between men and women. This misunderstanding is not just a trivial issue, it's something that can tear relationships apart, leaving people wondering why they can't seem to get along despite their best intentions. The problem I am talking about is this. Women, and I mean well-meaning, intelligent women, often misinterpret male behavior and motivations. And in doing so, they overlook the true nature of the man they are with. This, in turn, leads to resentment, confusion, and a sense of betrayal that need not exist if only the differences were recognized and respected. Let's take a closer look at this. Men and women, though equally human, are not the same. Their brains are wired differently. Their hormonal balances differ, and their emotional expressions can be entirely different. And yet, far too often, women expect men to behave the way they themselves would behave in a similar situation. This is a mistake that happens because women, as relational beings, tend to approach situations with an emotional lens zone that is rich with nuance and subtlety. Women often believe that a man should respond with the same depth of emotional understanding, or even the same communication style. They expect men to know intuitively how to react to things that matter to them, when in fact this couldn't be further from the truth. Men simply do not process things the same way. Let's consider a basic, everyday example. A woman might feel hurt by something a man said or didn't say, and she may respond by becoming distant, withdrawing emotionally, or expressing her disappointment in ways that seem clear to her. However, from the man's perspective, he might not understand why she's upset. He might not even know that over something was said that could have caused her distress. He might think everything is perfectly fine, even when she's obviously upset. But here is the thing. He's not being callous. He's not intentionally ignoring her feelings. He's simply not picking up on the signals she's sending. He might not even be aware of the emotional undertones that are so clear to her. This gap in perception can create huge divides in relationships because, from the woman's perspective, the lack of emotional understanding feels like neglect or indifference, even though that's not the case at all. This is where the misunderstanding comes in. A woman might think, he doesn't care about me, he doesn't understand me, and that belief can quickly morph into resentment. Meanwhile, the man might think, I don't know what she wants, I don't know what's going on, I can't fix it, and his frustration grows as he realizes that no matter how hard he tries, it doesn't seem to make a difference. Neither party understands the other's perspective, and neither sees that their misunderstanding of the other's nature is the core of the problem. The crux of this misunderstanding lies in the fact that men and women approach emotional conflict differently. When something bothers a man, he often seeks a solution. He wants to fix the problem, make it go away, and move on. Women, on the other hand, may seek validation and empathy before seeking a solution. They want their feelings acknowledged, they want to feel seen and understood before any action is taken. But the problem arises when these differing expectations collide. A man might think that offering a solution is the right approach when in fact what his partner needs is simply for him to listen, to show empathy, and to validate her experience. But because men tend to be solution-focused, they may miss that crucial step, leaving their partner feeling unheard. What makes this worse is that many women, particularly those who have grown up in a world where emotional expression is often seen as the key to connection, tend to assume that men should understand emotional cues innately. The idea is that if you express your emotions or frustrations in a certain way, your partner should automatically understand your needs and react accordingly. But here is the harsh truth. Men do not understand emotional cues in the same way. They process things differently. They may not even notice when something is wrong until it's pointed out. And even then, they may need clarity, directness, and time to process the situation on their terms. It's not because they don't care or because they don't love their partner. It's simply because their emotional framework is different. That's the reality. Now, this isn't to say that women should abandon their own emotional depth or stop expressing their feelings. No, the message here is that you must understand the differences in emotional processing between the genders and adjust your expectations accordingly. When you begin to realize that a man's lack of response or his focus on a solution is not a personal attack, but rather a reflection of how his brain is wired, you can stop taking things so personally. And when you can do that, you can stop the cycle of misunderstanding that so often leads to conflict and frustration. But the responsibility does not lie solely with women to understand men. Men too need to realize that they are not dealing with a mirror image of themselves. They need to recognize that women experience the world differently, more relationally, more emotionally, and with a deeper focus on nuance and connection. Men must work to listen attentively, to read between the lines, and to realize that sometimes just being present and offering empathy is the best solution. Often it's not about fixing the problem, but about acknowledging the emotions behind it. The greatest mistake in relationships isn't that we fail to communicate, it's that we fail to understand that the other person is seeing the world through an entirely different lens. When men and women don't recognize and respect these differences, they end up in a cycle of disappointment and disillusionment. But when they Dao-hen, they embrace the reality that emotional understanding isn't one-size-fits-all. Relationships can flourish. This mutual understanding can break down walls, build deeper connections, and foster true intimacy. The key is awareness, the willingness to step outside your own perspective and truly understand the person in front of you. If you can do that, if both parties can do that, then you have the foundation for a relationship that is not just functional, but genuinely fulfilling. One of the most destructive and insidious tendencies in relationships today is the habit of overcomplicating things. The human experience, when broken down to its core, is not as complicated as we often make it. Relationships are no exception. In fact, they thrive when we strip away unnecessary complexity, when we embrace simplicity and honesty. Yet, far too often, people, women especially, fall into the trap of overthinking, overanalyzing, and ultimately overcomplicating their relationships. This in turn creates an environment where things become confusing, overwhelming, and ultimately dysfunctional. Now, let's be clear. Emotions are complicated. Relationships are in many ways incredibly intricate and layered. But here is the thing. Complexity doesn't necessarily lead to better relationships. In fact, when complexity enters a relationship, it often breeds uncertainty and fear. Instead of simplifying things, we entangle ourselves in webs of doubt, assumptions, and unrealistic expectations. We start to create problems where none exist, and by doing so, we set ourselves up for failure. The reason this is such a dangerous mistake is that it blinds us to the simple truths that are often staring us in the face. Instead of seeing the reality of the relationship for what it is, we get lost in a maze of what it could be, what it should be, and what we think it might be. And in doing so, we forget to see each other clearly. Take a moment and think about the last time you overcomplicated something in your relationship. Perhaps you found yourself obsessing over a minor disagreement, dissecting every word spoken, every gesture made, trying to read between the lines for hidden meanings. You might have wondered whether your partner really meant what they said, or whether their lack of response was a sign of something deeper, something more ominous. Maybe you spent days analyzing every aspect of a conversation, unsure if you had said the right thing or if you had done something wrong. What happens when you do this? The result is that you create problems that weren't there in the first place. You start questioning the stability of your connection, wondering if something is wrong when, in reality, the relationship might be perfectly fine. The result is unnecessary stress, emotional exhaustion, and ultimately a sense of insecurity. The tendency to overcomplicate things in relationships stems from a deep-seated fear of being misunderstood, rejected, or abandoned. This fear can be paralyzing, and it can cause people to twist themselves into knots, desperately trying to figure out every possible scenario and every possible outcome. But here is the brutal truth. You cannot control how another person behaves, you cannot predict the future, and you cannot force a relationship to be what you want it to be. When you attempt to control every aspect of your relationship, when you overcomplicate things, you are only sowing the seeds of doubt and anxiety. You are allowing fear to dictate your actions, and in doing so, you create distance rather than connection. This is particularly dangerous because when women overcomplicate relationships, they often neglect the simple needs and desires that are at the core of any healthy relationship. Relationships thrive when both parties can be open, honest, and clear with each other. But when you overthink every interaction, every word spoken, and every gesture made, you prevent yourself from being truly present. You are too busy trying to analyze and decipher to actually engage with the person in front of you. Instead of enjoying the simple joys of connection, you are bogged down by the weight of your own anxieties and assumptions. The key here is recognizing that relationships are not about perfection. They are about connection, mutual respect, and understanding. They are not about getting everything exactly right, but rather about being open to growth, being willing to make mistakes, and being able to communicate openly and honestly with one another. When you overcomplicate things, you forget this. You get lost in a sea of what-ifs and shoulds, and you begin to expect too much from your partner. You expect them to be the solution to all of your emotional needs, to always know exactly what you are thinking, to respond in precisely the way you need them to. But this is unrealistic. No one can meet every single need or anticipate every single emotional nuance. And when you demand this level of perfection from someone, you only set yourself up for disappointment and frustration. The antidote to this overcomplication is simplicity. Simplicity in communication, simplicity in expectations, and simplicity in your approach to one another. When you can communicate openly, without hesitation, and without the need to constantly analyze and second guess, you open the door to a deeper and more authentic connection. You stop overthinking every word, every gesture, and every moment. You stop looking for hidden meanings where none exist, and you start embracing the beauty of straightforwardness. But simplicity doesn't mean avoiding depth. It doesn't mean glossing over important conversations or ignoring real issues. No, simplicity means focusing on what truly matters and letting go of the unnecessary distractions. It means being present in the moment, communicating with clarity, and understanding that relationships are about progress, not perfection. When you simplify your approach, you create space for real connection. You remove the barriers of fear, doubt, and insecurity that so often cloud your judgment. And most importantly, you create a relationship that is sustainable, one that is grounded in reality rather than in impossible expectations. Here is the final point. You can't create something beautiful by obsessing over every detail. You can't force a relationship to be perfect, because perfection doesn't exist. The more you overcomplicate things, the more you distance yourself from the very thing you seek: a simple, honest, and meaningful connection. When you let go of the need to control every aspect, when you stop overanalyzing and overthinking, you make room for the relationship to flourish naturally. And that's when you can truly experience what it means to be with someone in a way that is real, grounded, and fulfilling. In relationships, one of the most significant mistakes that women often make is failing to take full responsibility for their own emotional state. This is not to say that emotions aren't complex, or that we don't all experience times of deep emotional turmoil, But it is crucial to recognize that the responsibility for managing one's emotions rests primarily with the individual. When a person is in a relationship, it is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that your emotional well-being should be the responsibility of your partner. But this is not only unfair to the other person, it also undermines your own ability to grow, to mature, and to build a relationship that is based on mutual respect and strength. One of the most challenging aspects of emotional responsibility is recognizing that emotions, while powerful, are often not rational. They come and go, they rise and fall, and they can feel overwhelming. But they are not facts, they are not truths. They are signals, yes, but they are not directives. When you place the burden of your emotional health entirely on another person, you not only put them in an impossible position, but you also abdicate your own agency. You hand over control of your emotional state to someone who cannot possibly have the same level of understanding or control over it as you do. You expect them to fix what only you can truly fix within yourself. This is a dangerous game to play because it creates a dynamic of dependency, one that is inherently unstable and unsustainable. Let's look at this more closely. In any relationship, whether it's with a partner, a friend, or even a colleague, your emotional state is yours to manage. When you expect others to constantly manage or fix your emotions, you are essentially outsourcing your personal responsibility. This not only burdens the other person, but it also deprives you of the opportunity to learn how to deal with your emotions in a mature, constructive way. The idea that someone else should be responsible for making you happy, for validating your feelings, or for rescuing you from your own emotional upheavals is not only unrealistic, it is also deeply disempowering. It denies you the opportunity to develop resilience, to face your emotions head on, and to learn how to navigate the complexities of life without relying on others to smooth over every rough edge. When you fail to take responsibility for your own emotional state, you end up putting your partner in a position where they are expected to constantly read your mind, to anticipate your needs, to fix whatever is wrong. But relationships are not about mind reading. They are about mutual understanding, respect, and communication. When your emotional well-being is dependent on someone else's actions or moods, you set yourself up for disappointment. The problem is that you can never control another person's behavior or how they respond to you. People have their own lives, their own struggles, their own perspectives, and they cannot always be there to manage your emotions. Expecting them to be your emotional caretaker, your fixer, is not only unfair to them but also to you. It strips away your autonomy and your sense of self. This is not to say that relationships should be devoid of emotional support. On the contrary, a healthy relationship involves mutual care, empathy, and understanding. But these qualities should be based on the recognition that each person is responsible for managing their own emotions. When you take responsibility for how you feel, you empower yourself to make decisions that are grounded in reality, not in emotional reaction. You can communicate your needs and feelings clearly without expecting someone else to take on the role of your emotional savior. You learn how to navigate the ups and downs of life with integrity, and this fosters a sense of strength and independence that is incredibly attractive to a partner. The challenge, of course, is learning to manage your own emotional state, especially in moments of conflict or stress. It's easy to fall into the trap of believing that when things aren't going well in your relationship, it's because your partner isn't doing enough to support you, isn't doing enough to make you feel validated or heard. But this belief creates a cycle of emotional dependence, where you are constantly waiting for the other person to fill a void that only you can fill for yourself. True emotional responsibility means taking a step back, recognizing that you are not at the mercy of your feelings, and understanding that you can create your own emotional stability regardless of the external circumstances. It's also important to understand that taking emotional responsibility doesn't mean suppressing your feelings or ignoring your emotions. No, it means acknowledging your emotions and processing them in a way that is constructive and healthy. It means learning how to sit with discomfort, how to tolerate the complexity of your own inner world without letting it overwhelm you. When you take responsibility for your emotions, you stop expecting your partner to solve everything, and you start to see them as someone with whom you can share your feelings, not someone who has to bear the weight of them. You learn to communicate your needs in a way that is direct and honest, without demanding that the other person fix your emotional state. This shift in perspective is incredibly powerful. It transforms your relationships from a place of emotional dependency to a space where both individuals can grow, evolve, and become better versions of themselves. It fosters a deeper sense of respect because each person understands that the other is capable of handling their own emotional landscape. It allows for true partnership, where both people are strong and self-sufficient and can come together not because they need each other to survive, but because they want to share in the joy of life, to support each other in their growth, and to build something greater than what either could create alone. So, the bottom line is this: take responsibility for your emotions. Don't place the burden of your happiness on anyone else. Own your feelings, learn from them, and understand that they do not define you. When you do this, you free yourself from the chains of emotional dependence, and you free your partner to be the best version of themselves, without the constant pressure of trying to fix or manage your emotional world. Relationships thrive when both people are strong, self-aware, and emotionally responsible. And when you take responsibility for your emotional state, you will not only become more resilient, but you will also become more capable of creating a healthy, fulfilling, and lasting relationship. The final mistake that many women make in relationships, and one that is often overlooked or even consciously ignored, is the failure to understand the importance of respect for their partner's individuality and autonomy.